Okay, so welcome to another PHNX Community Call. As always, this will be recorded and loaded into the library, and you can watch back over it as many times as you want, whatever speed you want. And please always reach out and ask any questions, either in the group or directly to me, if you think of anything that comes off of the back of this. So today, we're going to be talking about making decisions and emotional stress and the relationship that these two things can potentially have. And we are going to look at it from a coaching perspective. So, what does this mean to us as coaches, and what kind of things do we have to think about if we are under stress as coaches? And we all know that sometimes we are under stress, sometimes more than others. And then the second part, we're just going to have a little bit of a consideration around what we can do to help support our clients that might need to make decisions and have emotional stress or different kinds of pressure put upon them that would make the decision a difficult one to make. So, as always, we have the consideration that emotions are not the enemy. They are of a good decision necessarily, but they, if left unchecked and unmastered, are often the companion of bad ones. So we can often use and fuel certain feelings around actions that we want to take, and that can really help motivate us and facilitate movement in executing those actions. But they're often, or can, if we have unmastered ones or ones which are read wrongly or left to become out of control, they often accompany bad decisions as well, and often can start to create a sense of habitual, if I feel this emotion, I'm going to make that decision. So, that can often transfer into maladaptive coping behaviors when we think about it from a client's perspective, but also if we're thinking about it from our perspectives as coaches. If we feel something and something comes up when we're delivering sessions or we're having discussions or conversations or whatever it might be, do we then decide to make a decision around that because of that emotion, which isn't always necessarily the right one for us as coaches, the clients, or the coaching relationship moving it forward? So some of these trigger moments that I've certainly experienced these in my coaching career, and I would imagine that the majority of people listening to this that have been involved in coaching will have potentially experienced some of these trigger moments. So clients quitting mid-program and check-ins that don't go to plan. So these can sometimes work hand in hand if you have a period of check-ins that aren't going to plan, or you're not quite getting the right traction, the right kind of engagement, and then you see the client that drops off after 2, 3 months or whatever, when there was a period of time that you'd agreed to go through the coaching. So, these moments when they happen for us as coaches, they will create an emotional response, and it will do. And in theory, it should do, because if it doesn't, and we're like, whatever, or that didn't go well, push it to one side, then there's the missed opportunity to learn from it. So, trigger moments of emotion: clients quit mid-program, check-ins don't quite go to plan. Safeguarding moments come up. Now, when we think about the different kind of conversations that can happen in different contexts with clients, as a coach, whether you're in a fitness environment or whether you're in a broader sense of coaching, has the potential to bring up certain more in-depth aspects. Now, safeguarding could be multiple different things and varying different severities as well, which is really important to remember. So, you can have a safeguarding issue, which is, as soon as it goes into safeguarding, it's in safeguarding. But there are certain, obviously, things in which you need to consider that could be more impactful in a negative way quicker. which need to be addressed in a different way. So safeguarding, if we're coaching and the safeguarding moment comes up, it's going to feel awkward. It's going to feel sometimes threatening to us as coaches or threatening to the coaching relationship, or it can have a mixture of emotions that come up where we're then left with a decision that we have to make. But this again is part of coaching. And when we think about the idea of, let's take health and fitness as an example, if we have a client that brings up something to do with, a relationship they're in that could be potentially fractious or causing issues, then how do we deal with that as a coach? And how do we feel about that as a coach? And what kind of conversations should we have or can we have within the scope of practice? Think about eating patterns, or we think about the volume of exercise that someone might be engaging in, such as like addictive behavior of exercise. Some of these things that come up within our coaching based conversations will make us feel a certain way and will make us then have to act upon that feeling. And the choice of action we take is going to be very important for us as coaches in order to be able to elevate our game. Trigger moments when we reach exhaustion. And this, I can personally say that, when I was probably in my mid 20s, early 30s, there was a sense of volume of sessions, amount of engagement with coaches. I was also teaching at one of the colleges that I taught at as well. And there were times where I had emotional reactions because I was exhausted. So your level of energy and emotional bandwidth that you've got are generally hand in hand. If you are low on energy, your emotional bandwidth is probably going to go lower. And then if you are triggered for whatever reason or something happens in a moment, then the capacity to be able to respond rather than react accordingly within that session is going to be the challenge as a coach. And pressure to choose within in a coaching conversation, this can sometimes be a point of reference where you don't want to give it a binary, a black and white, or a definitive answer, but there seems to be pressure that's put on you in the conversation you're having. And sometimes you have a client which might want to elicit advice from you, which you can give advice if there's permission and that conversation is where it should be in order to do that. But when there's a client that's pushing you for advice, how does that make you feel as a coach? We have to think about the ethical standpoints that we hold, that when we think how to communicate, giving advice or moving from and into a more directive position as a coach starts to change the dynamic. And sometimes that can be a bit strange for us as coaches because it's not how it should be. So there's this idea around being able to monitor that and adjust accordingly to that and it not lead to an emotional reaction. These are just some. I'm sure that, you guys have got other moments that you can think of which have created an emotional response in yourselves, both positive and negative. It's obviously both sides of the coin. And when you think about the invisible weight of coaching, I actually posted on this a reel on Instagram the other day because I was thinking about this when I was writing it, and we don't really talk about this in coaching. There's a lot of talk about programming. There's a lot about the idea of what works well from a very objective, from a very rational, from a very pragmatic point of view. But actually, when it comes down to the weight in which we have to carry as coaches, when a client is bringing emotional labor to the session. And this can be in so many different ways. It can be specific about the particular session or coaching journey, health and fitness, but it can also be threaded into so many different areas within that person's life that are at play, work, relationships, they could feel stuck traveling, they could feel like they're missing out on things. There's so many different things in which the client can channel those emotions and then through conversation bring them into the session with yourself. And I think that it's a good thing because it means that you've created a channel of communication there and a place where that person feels that they can have wider conversations with you. And actually, that can only lead to, if managed in accordance, it can lead to a place of deeper connection, understanding, and being able to relate to your client and understand your client in a better way. But the problem comes if we're in a situation where they're bringing negative emotion or frustration or even anger into the session, and it's dragging the session into that place where they are mentally. And that could not only have an effect from a coaching perspective on that session, but if you don't have the opportunity to recalibrate, or if you haven't had the strategy to remain and have some level of detachment from your client's emotions, then that can ultimately have a negative effect on like the rest of your day or the rest of your week or wherever you kind of like sit with regards to that. So there is this consideration to be made around the idea of emotions having the wherewithal to support, but also can undermine as well. And it's the awareness level of that that will ultimately lead to it being productive or it being an issue. Again, emotions aren't enemy, they're just data. And what we really don't want to do, what is for me and for for Phoenix and for what I aim to achieve within supporting people is I don't want people to become robotic in coaching in order to be able to protect this kind of or ring fence this idea of emotions, because they have to come in, they have to be at play. And we're really here to increase awareness of how emotions can influence and therefore bring us into like an astral position outside looking in where we can manage emotions, master emotions, and ensure that there is clarity rather than distortion over what is presented to us when someone comes into a session and how we're feeling and how our emotions are at play. So this is Gandalf because I think he's quite wise. He didn't start off that wise, but he ended up pretty wise. So whenever we talk about wisdom and the coaching of wisdom, you're probably going to see Gandalf floating about. But this we can break down into three systems, and I know we've spoken about this before, but it's good to reiterate the fact that system one is fast, intuitive, and emotional, which is the gut feeling, that kind of slightly reactive in that sense. It's more reactive than system two, which is more slow, which is analytical, has a logical foundation to it. And if you're thinking about this within a coaching context, if you feel an emotion or that comes up and then you're in a sense of fast system one, you might step in and say something that is almost like protective of the client, for example, if something's happening in their life. But then if we look at system two, there is almost this conscious, like if you're focusing on writing out the program or explaining the program or such forth. So both systems are at play within a coaching session. But when we think about how we are delivering a quality session, it needs to be almost a sweet spot of the two and the one that's being used at the right time, at the right volume and magnitude for the right reasons. So if you think about almost like a third system, and this is the stoicism of the rational, the emotional, and the wise mind. So you have the idea of having to be able to recognize what's going on and then make a decision on what kind of a system is right to kind of be lent into more than the other. And neither is about necessarily, this isn't about ignoring the emotions or suppressing or anything like that, but it's not about being ruled by them either. So it's reaching that sweet spot of like, where are we? What's going on? How do I need to appropriate myself correctly within this particular conversation? Sometimes there is going to be the need for intuition and that gut feeling, but then sometimes there's going to be need to push that to one side a little bit and then actually look at the more deliberate and the slower analytical side of things. Now, this is a bit interesting because I found out something about this. The neuroscience of the stool was basically around how, without emotion and this part of the process, without it, there is very little traction that can be actually gained. Now, the premise of this particular the guy that came up with these 3 points I'm going to make, Jonah Lehrer, actually has been brought into disrepute, which I found out after writing this. But not for anything too major, but he's self-plagiarized for some reason, like writing articles from brought him around from others. But before that, he had some really good neuroscience stuff, which is what this is focused on. And one of the things that he really kind of had a focus on was the fact that people with somewhat of a damaged or dysfunctional emotional processing struggled to make decisions. They struggled to get to the prioritization of the options that were in front of them. They were confused or overwhelmed, or they couldn't link together a sensible, rational um, because they weren't focused on the feelings that were coming along with it. So without the emotion, there is almost a stalling effect on what should be prioritized and what decisions should be made. And I think that when we're in a situation of coaching, the questions when we're laying out our decision making is, well, what's the most important thing? There is the rational side, but without the what feels right to me as a coach, how should this conversation go? What should I ask first? What should I lean into now? These kind of feelings as a coach are really important, and that is to say that if we don't connect with them within a session, well, maybe we will prioritize things wrong. Maybe we won't get it right. So again, we're leaning into the fact that emotions can be a real important factor within coaching and should be included and brought in on a thoughtful level in a way in which it supports the client. Now, Antonio Damasio is a little bit there's less uh, there's less of a controversy around this chap. So the somatic marker hypothesis. Now, this is interesting because the signals that we have within the body tie up to emotions, and then these emotions act as markers that help us guide decision making, generally speaking, by allowing us to almost like connect with the advantages and the disadvantages, but in a real sense of how does that make you feel. This is obviously some of the body to brain interactions. And some of the neuroscience behind that is that amygdala and the ventromedial prefrontal cortex kind of they work in somewhat of a conjunction with one another. But the key insight here is that without these emotional markers, again, individuals will struggle to prioritize and choose between options. So connecting to those feelings can often help to increase the decision making that's made and also increase the quality of the decision that's made, but not ignoring logical reasoning either. So it's just a further kind of like emphasis on being able to bring together the right kind of blend in order for the coaching uh, session to move in the direction that it needs to. So key points from this kind of research was that emotion helps prioritize speed and decision making. Without emotion, decision making tends to stall, and emotion affects the decision direction and the speed. But when we think from a client perspective with decision direction and speed, and also a fourth point was emotion as a contextual motivator, when we think about these two aspects as us as coaches, we might go, okay, we're going to do this and we're going to do it now. Let's get it done. It feels right. Whereas if the emotions are distorted, the chances of us making a bad decision if we're not able to reflect on our emotions can also come into play. And with clients, that can be seen as like behaviors that they choose driven by distorted emotions, which can obviously, if left unchecked, result in bad decision making, poor decision making, but making those decisions quickly and motivated towards the wrong kind of things. When we think about it, just splitting this into the coaches and the clients' perspectives, suppressing emotion equals suppressing information. So the idea that even if the emotion is, somewhat negative or holds negative, to suppress that would be suppressing information, and avoiding it would be avoiding information and data that can point us in the right direction of why clients are making decisions. If we think about it from a coaching perspective, if we ignore our emotions, let's say, for example, we need to have a difficult conversation and it's making us feel a bit anxious or worried, but we suppress that information or avoid facing that emotion, and then eventually that action will be to not have that difficult or challenging conversation with the client. So we can see how to avoid or to suppress our emotions as coaches, given context that we find ourselves in, or even with our clients, if they're doing the same thing, we're really lacking the information that we need to be able to create the best kind of conversation and then the right kind of traction moving forward. And the third point here, when we think about the dysregulated emotion and the distorted prioritization and subsequent decisions, this is where if we ignore a dysregulated motivation, well, then, a dysregulated emotion, then we're never going to be able to face it, understand it, come to terms with it, and subsequently regulate it in order for our priorities and our decisions to be more aligned. So, obviously, the stressful side of things that can come into our worlds as coaches, and these are pretty important considerations, but we also really need to stay fairly objective when we consider them, i.e., not get too consumed by it. So we think about what the science is saying. So anxiety, as that kind of emotion that comes into play, is often perceived as a threat, and this, generally speaking, if left untapped, becomes a negative outcome. But facing the reality and understanding what actions can be taken, or if in fact what we're perceiving is correct, is actually a threat, is the key to managing how this emotion comes into play. So within our own coaching context, we might find ourselves anxious about a client that's coming in, or something that's not going particularly well, or we might find that we feel anxious about our capabilities in one particular area. Now, these things need to be addressed, but how we address them is very much around the actions that are taken and after processing and understanding the emotional data that's being presented to us. When we think into how that can come across in a coaching context, if it's not dealt with, thinking about overcorrecting a client's plan as an example, or if we're worried about the client not necessarily making the results or getting the results they need, and we perceive that as a negative situation, we're worried about that, we might double down on the intensity when a client actually needs to kind of take their foot off the gas and recover a little bit. And from a business perspective, if we're looking at services or our setup that we have from a financial perspective, we might like drop prices if we're anxious about that side of things. So, we can see that this stress anxiety can drop in and then affect our coaching from multiple different angles. The idea of how stress distorts the decisions that were potentially made is we tend to lean into more short-term outcomes that we think will alleviate that when it won't, i.e. we end up just kicking the can down the road and not dealing with the actual matter at hand and will alleviate that stress. So biasing short-term outcomes can often be seen in that as well. But if we split these down into some stressful pressure points that we might, and these are just going to be a couple that we understand from a coaching perspective within our lens that we're looking through, we can often see stresses in, like, let's just say these three areas, so client, business, and internal. So when we think about the client, stress that can sometimes be presented, emotional issues that can kind of come up is if our clients are trauma dumping or bring in like really loads of heavy stuff to the session. And that can often cause, and especially if it's session after session after session, without actually addressing that as a coach in an appropriate way, that can cause, quite a high level of stress load to build up. And that's not always particularly obvious either. It can sometimes be a very subtle, accumulative impact, a negative impact that happens. Non-compliance, when we've got clients dropping out or just not, having this non adherence to various different things that we've put time into being able to present to them and give to them, whether it's a training plan, whether it's resources to use, documents, whatever it might be. This kind of like non-compliance can sometimes build up that stress. And the idea when these kind of and this can be a real sticking point when it comes to the idea of safeguarding. It links into it a little bit when we think about body image or disordered eating, eating disorders, any of those things. If a client has those aspects running in their within their coaching journey, that can be quite stressful as coaches to have to uh, take that on board and manage that accordingly and ethically and reflect on that. And in that sense, that can bring in almost this questioning over yourself as a coach, right? You're in a situation, someone's struggling with certain aspects and they're quite heavy, and then that can sometimes cause yourself to reflect and think potentially negatively about the situation you're in as a coach. So client facing and interactions can sometimes really crank up the stress, and it's worth having a sense of preservation around that and a strategy around that in order to be able to keep yourself well. Business facing, we often find that, and this is no different when we're on social media and such forth, comparisons that we make with other coaches, other business providers and such forth, and we see this kind of projected outcomes that are being reached, which we don't know, but we compare, and that can sometimes cause stress. Revenue instability can be an issue. And then we also think about how if we receive negative feedback directly after we've asked for it, or potentially just for unsolicited negative feedback, which happens from time to time, that can often cause an increase in that emotional stress level. Internally speaking, and this is just three things to think about here. Imposter syndrome, how we often feel like we're in a place where we're delivering or running something that we might think, well, should I be really doing this? Is this really where I should be? Am I really good enough for this? So imposter syndrome can cause unwanted levels of stress. General fatigue, when we think about how the industry can sometimes really demand quite a lot of time and mental capacity and physical capacity as well. So the overall fatigue can build up that level of stress from an internal perspective. And then when we think about our identity as a coach, what we can sometimes do is not have the capability of separating the person from the job. And that can cause internal friction and stress as well. And it's worth practicing being able to separate who you are as an individual and what you do as an individual there will be overlaps, but they're not completely consumed by one another. They are not the same thing. So, just from a practical standpoint of how to maybe think about the idea of when we have an emotional standpoint that creates a response or that creates a reaction or a response, the idea for us to be able to go through a very simple, very structured and unconvoluted process in order to be able to bring around that astral position to observe and to understand and then create the response we need. So we're naming what's going on. And we don't have to become overly consumed by what's going on, but to name it and understand it and then be able to separate the facts from the fiction. And that's quite an important thing, the assumption from the reality. So when we have this process of separating it and only going off what we know, we can then start to bring around the correct way to respond. And when we respond, we don't have to respond in a quick and a rushed or unthoughtful manner. But in some cases, time is quite an important factor to consider. So it's finding the sweet spot between being urgent in your response and also being ensuring that there is value alignment. And a lot of what I do with people, and just this morning I was working with someone and we were discussing how when we think about the decisions that we make, it all comes back to the value proposition. Is this aligned with the values that I hold? If so, yes. Or if not, then why am I doing it? Or if there is more nuance to it, how much aligned is this with my values? And the values that often have to be robust are the ones in business. We obviously have to have our own personal values, need to be robust as well. But when we think about how we are battered and bruised and pulled and pushed within business to actually hold firm a set of values, even though things seem really urgent and rushed, and for us to respond in an appropriate way within any kind of coaching conversation, a consultation we have, uh, a meeting with another coach or potential employee, or any of those kind of aspects, to be able to balance the right kind of response with urgency, but also value alignment is a really important thing to be able to do. And one thing that's worth considering with the decision making that's made is almost having a bit of a mantra checklist. And ultimately, it's your choice what the checklist is. There's just some suggestions here. Does this maintain psychological safety? I think that's a pretty important one to actually put up there. As in, like, yeah, let's put that one in everyone's list. Do no harm, very important. Um, Protecting client autonomy, facilitating long-term growth. Is this for the client's progress, or is this fulfilling my need as a coach? Can this provide insight and learning? Because actually, that's what coaching is, insight and learning. And am I acting from an intuitive position here, or is my ego taking over on the wheel? I mean, funnily enough, this is more or less my checklist as it happens, guys, but I'm not saying you need to take my checklist and go with it. But these are the kind of reflections that I make when I'm having coaching conversations, and I try and have them in the moment as much as you can. But then obviously it's good to have as a reflective process post session, just to kind of like sense check where you are and how that coaching conversation's gone. So if we take this more specifically into thinking about working with clients directly now, so the idea of clients co-regulating is a really important thought that often can sometimes be let slip. How you are coming into a session, the pace that you talk, how you bring the right kind of tonality, the energy that you have, and the space that you enter into will become a reflection of that. So if you are looking to support the regulation of a client, you need to be regulated yourself. You need to have the wherewithal to hold a sense of peace and serenity as best you can, and then imagine it like a bridge and a connection. And we've said this around empathy as well. If you can almost like see empathy as a bridge where you understand and you walk across the bridge, you understand and then you join, and you never necessarily cross onto their side, but of the bridge, but the bridge becomes connected. And it's not really any different when we think about regulation. You go into a space and you might have a client that's very jittery, anxious, or stressed, or angry, or frustrated, and you're not going to invalidate that, but you also aren't going to become that. So you need to go in and anchor yourself, and then they come into a regulated state and you meet. And that is a really important point when you think about how you can't make good decisions from dysregulated positions. So you can't have a good coaching conversation. You can't promote insight and learning. You can't have these types of progress that you need within coaching if there is lack of regulation. So taking in an emotional regulation aspect into your work, into your coaching sessions is really important. And I mean, this kind of reiterates the fact clients don't decide from total calm, but they need some sort of calm. They need some sort of foundational stability point where they can actually make a decision around what they're going to next, have that priority, have that understanding of what's important to them, understand about how it links back to their values and then decisions they make. If they're in a position of complete disarray and emotional, visceral feelings and all flying around in a chaotic sense, like this guy on the right hand side, you're not going to be able to make the most out of the coaching conversation. Conversely, clients don't make decisions from the guy on the left hand side. There is this bit in the middle which has to be achieved in order to be able to make the right kind of decisions. Some of the things that we see when things don't go right, when we're thinking about how our coaching and can have an impact and in a positive way for someone who is thinking about quitting. If they're holding emotions of shame or frustration, validating their emotion, temporally speaking, slowing down, and then linking back and revisiting values is often a great way to be able to support someone who is in that realm of potentially quitting. The slowing down allows there to be that reflection time, which allows the revisiting of the values. Obviously, if it's too rushed and too frantic, too much urgency in how you respond, then that can often perpetuate and end up in a negative outcome. And we think about someone who might be panicking. So a client that is or feels like they're in a threat position, and could be injury, could be fear, could be things not going right for them. The reduction in the urgency, again, is a key factor. And then moving into this, as you would have done yourself as a coach, if you were affected by something, you would clarify the facts, what's data versus what's distortion. And then you would look at how can we change some of the options that are ahead of you so that they don't seem like they're so threatening, or that you can enter into them in a less panicked, more regulated state in order to be able to make good decisions. And this can really be seen in this kind of framework, which I often use in order to be able to uh, promote a little bit of a timeout. If you promote a bit of a timeout, and this can often work quite. And if you're in a online check-in or on Zoom, or you're in person in a gym, it doesn't really matter. It's about just kind of creating this little three-step place of regulating it by slowing the timeline down and then separating that identity factor And you'll hear this if you're coaching people, where people can sometimes bring this "I am a failure" to "I had a setback." So a lot of it's like reframing language, and that can have a positive effect on that person's perception of where they are. So this little, I hear how this is frustrating. Is this a now decision, or can we take a bit of time? Can we reflect a little bit? Do we have the opportunity to do that? Can we create the opportunity to do that? Because that will allow there to be more of a processing and therefore a response that is more appropriate for that person, depending on what goal they have or what they're looking to achieve. And actually, once you've modeled this within a coaching conversation, you've emphasized it and you've put it into play. This is the type of thing that a client, sorry, when they go out into their day-to-day environment, whether it be work, whether it be home, this is the kind of almost process that they want to be talking to themselves. So let's say, for example, it's almost like a promotion of self-coaching. If they're in a argument at home, for example, and with a partner, and there's this sense of, oh, this is a really stressful, heightened situation. Okay, I can hear that this is what's going on here. I'm going to step back. I'm not going to respond now. I don't need to respond now. I'm going to create a bit of space. And then, in the sense of, I'm not a bad partner, but I've had a bit of an altercation you know, with my partner. It's kind of like being able to break it down in a sense of it not then have negative effects on further decisions that are made. If we think about health and fitness, um, there's very much a sense of bringing this kind of regulation, slowing the timeline down, and then separating, like, I am a failure, I had a setback, when you think about nutrition, when you think about decisions that are made around nutrition, or when you think about decisions that are made around going to the gym or exercising. Any of these things are and can hold sway on someone's more wider sense of emotional well-being if they don't have a structure in order for them to move through challenging situations. As always, we have to bear in mind our scope of practice. So this is a kind of like depiction of how I see the work that exists within emotional mastery. You have mentoring, coaching, therapy, and you've got your client in the middle, which, sometimes the client might need a bit more mentoring, coaching, or more therapeutic conversations. Obviously, in the far ends of those triangles become more specific. However, emotional mastery and the ability to have emotionally led conversations should really circle the whole of this. It should be existing within mentoring. If you're talking about a business and the owner of the business is struggling with certain aspects of having to lay people off because the company's not making enough money, then that's going to be quite hard. And there is an emotional conversation to have around that. Coaching, obviously, around the different kind of um, ideas of what feels good from a training perspective, how someone might be struggling or feeling around nutrition. These are all around emotions. And then the therapy side of things, a little bit more stringent when we think about the actual side of clinical therapy and what have you. But there are still more caring, considerate, humanistic, therapeutic conversations that can be had without it needing to go into those kind of clinical settings. So just to finish off, something which I believe when we're thinking about coaching, or we're thinking about providing a service, providing something to an individual or a room of individuals, it's worth being the most regulated individual in the room, as much as you can be, of course. But one of these things that often proves to be useful is the capability of finding emotional regulation within stressful situations in order to be able to have the right conversations, make the right decisions, and ultimately move and progress forward with the clients that you're with, or the room that you're working with.